you cannot realize what the Warsaw Ghetto was if you look only at the fighting groups or only on those Jews who were hiding and disobeying the German orders. Because actually, if we were talking only about the fighting itself, impressive as it can be after such a long time of Nazi occupation, there were only a few days of shooting. There wasn't something very long. And if we were to be talking only of the civilian resistance, we were talking about Jews fleeing, running, hiding, staying in their hiding place, even when the houses are collapsing and so on. It wouldn't have the same impact. What we can see during the Warsaw Ghetto, and I think this is what made it so impressive, is the fact that people who resisted two different aspects of the Nazism acted in the same geographical sphere and in the same time.
My name is Susan Spurlock. I'm Executive Director of Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University, and I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's program. Founded in 1908, Ford Hall Forum has long been committed to the idea that democracy depends not only on free speech, but on informed, thoughtful engagement with the past and present. That mission feels especially vital today. We are honored today to welcome Havi Dreifuss, whose work challenges us to reconsider one of the most studied and symbolically powerful moments of the 20th century, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. In the People's Uprising, the fall of the Warsaw Ghetto, she brings forward new voices and perspectives, deepening our understanding of both resistance and the broader human experience within the ghetto. In conversation with her, Sven-Erik Rose, a distinguished scholar who has written and taught extensively on Holocaust literature, memory, and ethics. Together, they will explore not only the historical event, but also how we interpret, remember, and learn from it. At a time when the meaning of resistance, the complexity of historical memory, and the responsibility of witness remain pressing concerns, this conversation continues the forum's long tradition, creating a space where history is not static, but alive, debated, questioned, and made meaningful for our present. It's now my pleasure to introduce Sue Raymond, the director of the Brandeis University Press, who will offer brief remarks and introduce our distinguished panelists, Havi Dreifuss and Sven-Erik Rose. Sue?
Thank you, Susan. That was a terrific introduction. It is my pleasure to introduce today our guests on the almost anniversary of the rising of the Warsaw Ghetto, which is actually on the uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto, which was 84 years ago on Sunday, this coming Sunday, the 19th of April. So this program is especially timely. And I also want to acknowledge that Havi is zooming in from Jerusalem, where it is 7 o'clock in the evening, and Sven-Erik Rose is zooming in from Davis, California, where it is 9 o'clock in the morning. So we are geographically spread, and Susan and I are in Boston. So welcome, everybody. So I'd like to welcome Havi Ben-Sasson Dreifuss is Professor of Jewish History at Tel Aviv University, where she heads the Institute for the History of Polish Jewry and Israel-Poland Relations. She also serves as the director of the Center for Research on the Holocaust in Poland at Yad Vashem. She's the author of Relations Between Jews and Poles, The Jewish Perspective, and most recently, The People's Uprising and the Fall of the Warsaw Ghetto, April 1942 to 1943, which is published this month by Brandeis University Press in association with Yad Vashem. So we're delighted to be publishing this important book. And wonderfully, Sven-Erik has also written a book that we published last fall called Making and Unmaking Holocaust Literature in the Warsaw, Lodz, and Vilna Ghettos. So he is a perfect conversation partner. And Sven-Erik Rose is Professor of German and Comparative Literature at the University of California, Davis. His scholarship focuses on Holocaust literature, German Jewish thought, and the cultural and philosophical responses to trauma and memory. His first book, Jewish Philosophical Politics in Germany, 1789 to 1848, was awarded the Jordan Schnitzer Book Award from the Association of Jewish Studies in the category of philosophy and Jewish thought. He's written widely on critical theory and Holocaust representation. And as we said, his latest book, Making and Unmaking Holocaust Literature in the Warsaw, Lodz, and Vilna ghettos, brings literary analysis into dialogue with urgent ethical and historical questions about violence, resistance, and remembrance. So over to you both, and very much looking forward to your conversation.
Thank you so much for these introductions. And thank you to GBH and Brandeis University Press and Fort Hall Forum. It's truly, I'm very excited and honored for this opportunity to talk to Havi Dreifuss about her extraordinary new book, The People's Uprising and the Fall of the Warsaw Ghetto. It's an incredible work. And I wanted to, I'll just mention one note about the date and the kind of resonance of we're just a few days away from the anniversary of the beginning of the uprising. And in their infinite cynicism, Nazis frequently coordinated their attacks on Jews with Jewish holidays. And Passover began on April 19 in 1943. So that was why the uprising began, because they resisted the attempt to deport everyone from the ghetto that day. So I'm sure Havi Dreifuss will have more to say about that. But I wanted to start, Havi, with a question. You know, your astounding book, and Sue mentioned this, that it's about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and the sort of day-to-day experience of the excruciating, drawn-out end or liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto, culminating in the uprising. But since the uprising is one of the probably the singly most widely known, commemorated, depicted, and written about event in the history of the Warsaw Ghetto, I'd like to invite you to lay out the main claims of your book and in what ways your approach adds and perhaps revises the ample popular and historiographical treatments of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising.
Thank you very much, Sven. Eric, and actually, I'm very, very excited to be here and to talk about this new book. And as you said, we are just about to mention, to not celebrate, but to mention the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto, which is maybe, as you said, one of the most well-known events of the Holocaust. And many times it's a symbol much above the Holocaust of a human spirit and of fighting and resistance and things like that. And actually, it's one of the more researched events during the Holocaust, right after the Second World War. Much was written about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, but actually most of what was written concentrated on the fighting itself. And that is mainly on the two undergrounds who took part of it. It was Rzeszowo and the Job. One is more known than the other. One was headed by Mordechai Anilevich. The other one was headed by Pavel Frenkel. But in any case, all of those fighters were only a few hundreds of young people, men and women who were still in the ghetto, while there were almost 50,000 Jews who still lived in the ghetto during the uprising. So what I was trying to do in my work is to understand how did they live throughout those days and what was their part, if any, in the uprising. And I hope I managed to convince in the book and show how important their part was in the uprising itself, and that today we cannot talk about the uprising without referring to those tens of thousands of Jews who disobeyed Nazi orders. And when the Germans entered, the Germans' plans were very simple. They wanted to send the workers, and there were still few dozens, thousands of workers in the Warsaw Ghetto. They wanted to send them to the camps in Lublin area, and they wanted to send all the other Jews to Treblinka and kill them there. And actually, the fact that the Jews resist by fighting, but also by hiding and disobeying the Germans' order, made this event, which is so well known in the middle of Europe, in front of so many eyes, to what it really became a symbol for much more of what happened in those specific days.
Great. Maybe it would be helpful if you could talk. You mentioned there were some workers in the ghetto after the Great Deportation of the summer of 1942, and so before the uprising. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the composition of the different groups of people that remained in the ghetto after. So the Great Deportation was the summer of 1942, and that's when 90% of the ghetto inhabitants were murdered in Treblinka. And you have a lot about that phase, and I want to come back to the earlier part. But I think people maybe aren't so familiar with the kind of composition of different groups who remained there and where did they live and how did they live. And I think that would be helpful if you could lay that out a little bit.
Okay, great, because actually this is very important to remember that even those tens of thousands weren't one group. And as we already mentioned, much was written about daily life of the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, family life, economical life, and the vast majority of this was really ruined during the Great Deportation. You mentioned between July and September 1942, about 300,000 of Warsaw Jews are being sent to Treblinka and murdered there. And those who stayed in the ghetto found themselves in a completely different situation. It wasn't the ghetto as it was. First of all, from the geographical perspective, the southern part of the ghetto was returned to the Aryan side, which is very important because this will be what Jews will picture regarding their own future later on. So the Jews were taken from those streets and the streets were returned to the Poles. And in the northern part of the ghetto, the Jews could not live and walk as they wanted. They were concentrated in mainly three areas. One of them was called the Central Ghetto. One of them was called the area of the shop. The shop are factories, German factories within the ghetto where Jews worked and were forced to work, make uniforms and things like that. And there was a specific smaller shop, which is called the brushmaker shop. And Jews were actually in some kind of a concentration camp in the ghetto or what was left of the ghetto. Now, formally speaking, only 36,000 Jews were allowed to stay in the ghetto. So we need to understand, and actually, I think in your book, in the Making and Unmaking Literature in the Warsaw, you refer to the Warsaw as well as Lodz and Vilna ghetto, we can see this breaking point because before that there was a ghetto with all the problems and starvation and diseases. People still lived in some kind of what could resemble the life before the war. But now we're talking of a completely different situation. And as you said, 90% of the children did not survive. Before the Great Deportation, there were about 70,000 children under the age of 10. Now there were 250. There were almost no old people. Old is anybody older than 60. So everything changed. And in this ghetto, there were also wild Jews. Those are Jews who didn't have a permit to stay in the ghetto, but still they were hiding in the ghetto without a permit. And actually, we can see a very big difference between the Jews in each one of those different places. First of all, of what they understand of what happened to them and how they picture their future, although we know that later on the Germans will create a horrible and much more difficult future for them.
Yeah, so great. That's very helpful. Yeah, well, one of the things that I found really, one of the many things I should say that I found so deeply moving about your book, and your sort of day-to-day account of the experience of the Warsaw Ghetto, starting far before the uprising, but it's the way that you attend to the human experience, of being individually and collectively reduced to just unfathomable circumstances and forms of existence. And I think that the condition of life for Jews in the ghetto has a pernicious way of almost being naturalized. That by that I mean that when people see uh, just abject people, hungry people, starving people lying on the street in the Warsaw Ghetto, it's awful, but it's somehow not surprising in a sense that that's what we have come to expect. That's what we know, and so that's it's the Holocaust after all. That's how people were. And what your book really for me captures is the astonishing novelty and awful newness of this experience, right? That people are actually seeing themselves in their community and their loved ones and people that they maybe knew before the war and then often themselves in their own physical bodies utterly transformed in ways that they can't fathom. So that you see the human lived quality of this absolutely not it's not normal in any way, shape, or form, right? And how they thought and felt, and they're also very articulate about this awfulness. And so I wonder if you could just talk about how Jews are not only systematically reduced to abject status, but they are excruciatingly sort of aware of it and reflecting on it and feeling it and seeing it and thinking about it, even as these transformations are happening.
Thank you, Sven Eric, because this is really a great question. And actually, it's connected to something that you raised in a different circle, and that is the fact that I'm saying that I'm talking about the uprising, but I'm starting way before. And here I want to say that when I started reading, and there is a lot written about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising or the Warsaw Ghetto in general, we can see so many aspects of daily life and of how Jews lived and their family life and economical life and political and religious, any aspect you want. And as soon as we get to the Great Deportation, that is to July 1942, suddenly we stop talking about those things. And there are only two topics which are usually referred to. Actually, your book is a little bit different. One of them is death, and that is the sending of the Jews to Treblinka and killing them there. And the second one is uprising itself, meaning mainly only the fighting organizations. And what I wanted to show, and this is part of what you asked about, is that those daily life continued during first of all, during the Aktionen, during the Great Deportation. The Great Deportation of the Warsaw Ghetto, where during the ghetto existence, almost 500,000 Jews lived. This took about 2 months. This was day after day, a week after week. How did people find food? What happened to family connection? What happened to different political structures or anything else we can imagine? And what I was trying to do, and here I'm connecting directly to your question, is I was trying to understand their own point of view. And one of the heartbreaking part is exactly what you pointed out, and this is their awareness. Those Jews are very much aware of what is happening to them. They're aware of what is happening to the Jewish society. The fact that children are being just laid in the street, and it seems as if nobody cares. And they write about it themselves, that even if people do care, the fact that this is what is being seen in the public sphere, it's hard, it's difficult for them. And the fact that the German violence is done in the public sphere. So what I tried actually to do is to present those voices. And actually, I was thinking of a term that you use in your book. You talk about Heimlich, about unhoming. And I think that part of the story that I'm trying to present is really this uprooting, because we're talking about few months, and in those few months, time after time after time, everything changed. And those Jews are aware of that. They're aware of their misery. They're aware of the fact that their moral values are just being crushed. And in front of everybody, everything is happening in the eyes of many others. And their struggle to depict it, to explain it, to try to assure what will happen to them as individuals, as families, and as a society is something that I think we must be aware of. And this is what I was trying to do in this book regarding the Great Deportation, the days after the Great Deportation, when people start to understand the hell that they just went through, and later on towards the uprising and the uprising itself.
Yeah, thank you. It's so important, I think. And we tend to think of, I mean, I don't mean we, but just sort of the way that the story and the historiography has come down, that we think of sort of Nazis as the active agents and Jews as sort of the docile kind of objects. And your book shows so powerfully that Jews are actively thinking human beings, experiencing this all and trying to process it all, and it's so powerful. I'll just mention one poem from my book that I talked about, Josef Kierman, who talks about it's written in relation to the Great Deportation. It's called "The Eyes Remain Open," and it's exactly about that it doesn't stop. There's still a kind of daily life, and people are seeing it happen in real time. It's this. It's almost like the atrocity is so terrible that we think that the world must have just come to an end and time not continued, but in fact, daily life is just excruciatingly ongoing throughout it all, and people who remain alive have to live with it, and that's something that is so powerfully conveyed in your book, and I thank you for that. Um, you mentioned the question of knowledge, like when what people are trying to figure out, what is happening, and that's another question. I want to turn to that question of knowledge. Um, one of the questions that people often ask, and I think understandably, is when did people know? When did Jews in the ghettos or in when did they know that they're all going to be killed? And we one tends to think of knowledge as something like a light switch. It goes on and aha, it was dark and now everything's illuminated and I have knowledge that I didn't have before. But your book really shows how utterly complicated an issue of this such ultimate knowledge actually was. It was not like flicking a switch, right? It was a very complicated negotiation. And I wonder if you could elaborate what was involved in the question of how and why people knew or didn't know what their fate would be. What were the ways they're getting information? What are the kind of conflicting information they're getting? How are they trying to sort through questions of figuring out what's going on?
So, first of all, I think that here we should refer to an important methodological aspect. And this is many times in later testimonies, we can hear people say, my father always knew, or the minute the Germans entered, I knew that this or that will happen. And actually, when we read those sources written during the Holocaust themselves, itself, or when we read those literature works that you yourself have worked on, we can understand how complicated it is. And actually, there is a book of Maria Ferenc that is a Polish young scholar that is about to be published in English, referring to knowledge. But what I try to show in my book, as you said, is how complicated it was. So, first of all, there is a lot of information coming to the ghetto, but some of the information is true, and some of the information is misleading, and it's very difficult to understand what is what. And that's not only that. Today we know that the final solution didn't start itself in one decision. We know how that this also was some kind of development, and we can see that news are coming about the mass shooting in the east, but it's only in the east, so maybe it's only for Bolshevik Jews. And then they hear about Helmano, but this is happening in the west of those areas that were next to Germany, so it doesn't have anything to do with us. And then there are rumors about Belzec and about Jews from Lublin, and Lublin is really, really near to Warsaw. And what does it mean for us? And I think that one of the things that we can see when we read this, how humanly it is to disbelieve those awful rumors. They don't want to believe, and they have those awful things happen in many places, but it won't happen to me. I live in Warsaw, where there are hundreds of thousands other Jews. There are so many refugees here. About a third of the Warsaw Ghetto were refugees. If the Germans would have wanted to kill us, they would have killed us, in those different localities. They won't kill us here in the eyes of everything. This is a capital, a European capital. And actually, you can see people struggling to say, it won't happen in Warsaw. It won't happen to me. I will be okay. Even people that have all the knowledge. And here we should talk about the agencies. You mentioned the Jewish activeness. And here we should remember, this is very important. Jews were very active in trying to understand what is going on. And the problem many times is not only in their understanding, but in their helplessness. Because we have the refugees. And the refugees are getting so much information about all those places. But what can refugees do in the Warsaw Ghetto? We have rabbis that have their own connections and have information. What can they do? And even the underground, we're talking about the underground newspaper and so on. Who read those newspapers? Who believed those newspapers? So I think that those are things we should remember, as well as the fact that the Germans themselves are trying to mislead the Jews. They never talk about murder. There are letters, there are rumors, and I think the most important part is it's very difficult to believe awful news that never happened before, and their true nature is the end of anything you see around you, and that is just too difficult to comprehend for a very long time.
Yeah, and like you say, almost unbelievable. I mean, it's almost unbelievable even now, and we know that it happened, right? So I mean, but when it is unbelievable that they would kill all the Jews in Warsaw, the biggest Jewish city in Europe, in a European capital. That's, that's not crazy to think that that wouldn't happen before it happened, right? And also, I just want to emphasize something that you talk about in your book. Um, that with certain there was like the Nazis weren't unified in what their policy would be in killing Jews. So they were in the sort of the Himmler kind of the SS was hell bent on killing Jews for that reason because they were sort of ideologically committed to the project of killing Jews per se. But then there were opportunistic industrialists who are exploiting slave labor in the ghettos, and there are armament sort of officers and who are saying this is actually they're making military uniforms are useful. And so it's not like there was even an absolutely settled truth for some Jews to know, right? The Nazis didn't know it was still in dispute, and so some of that end is very open ended, even in for a long time, for longer than maybe people appreciate.
And I will add to that, their daily condition is so difficult. The poem that you refer to in your book of Shmuel Marvil, that is depicting the guys, the streets, they are so much struggling for daily life. How can they be occupied in those things that really doesn't sound as can really happen? Nobody can kill a whole community. Never, not speaking, of course, Warsaw Ghetto. And I think that this is another important thing that, if I can say, we can see that time after time, many Jews are explaining their present according to the past. So, the ghetto is hard and there are many different problems, but we cannot believe something that didn't happen before. And when people start to understand, and it takes time to really understand that this information is true, that the Germans are truly taking men, women, children, and murdering all of them. When Jews are understanding that, they think that this will be what will be happening to them next. And then when the Germans, as you said, for their opportunistic reasons, want to move part of the working Jews, to the camp in Lublin, so the Jews themselves, they don't believe it. They don't believe that the Germans will send anybody to any other place but Treblinka. And they don't go to those places. And they really believe that what will happen is that the Germans will send Jews from the ghetto, will return those streets to the Polish part of the city as was before, and then they can survive because, it's only a question of a few months that the Russians will come here. So I think that when we read those Jewish sources, the cultural one, the diaries, the testimonies taken during the war itself, they can show us how they build their world that many times, actually always, didn't expect the awful days that are coming toward them.
Yeah, right, and as you also say, but they weren't irrational in their interpretations, right? I mean, the idea that the Red Army was, could have come in, and they could have come earlier a little bit if they had wanted to, but also that they might be able to hide, and those streets where they were hiding might, like as after the Great Deportation, might be returned to the so-called Aryan zone of Warsaw, and they might be able to escape. And so they're making the rational decisions, but it was just there were no decisions that would actually end in living. That's I think the ultimate
This is the
reality.
choiceless choices that
Yeah,
Lawrence
choices,
Langer was
choices.
talking about. And as you said, it doesn't make any sense that everybody is being killed. It makes more sense that the Russians, they already hear about what happened in Stalingrad. And there are more bombing of Warsaw during the weeks and the months before the uprising. And many different Jews who are not connected are talking about a question of only half a year, 6 months, and the Russians will be here. Today we know it took much more. But when so many people really are preparing themselves in a logic way, which again, if there wasn't for the German brutality to the way that they fought this uprising, the way they fought not only the fighters, but the Jews who were in hiding, so, maybe people could have survived. So as you said, they are trying to have the most logical decisions in an unlogical world, which is all the time just turning upside down.
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, that's another very hard thing for knowledge, right? When you're trying to interpret and all of the categories of any kind of logical thinking are just they're upside down. I want to ask you You mentioned rabbis and sort of as one of the networks in which they could communicate and the political resistance, and they had their underground papers that were read sort of within their own communities. Could you talk, that's religious life in the Warsaw Ghetto is something I know that you've written on and some others have written on, but I think it still remains an underexplored aspect of life in the Warsaw Ghetto. And I wondered if you could talk about, religious Jews' struggle to continue to lead observant Jewish lives, even in the most extreme situations.
Okay, so I'm not objective here because my next book will talk about religious life of
Okay.
Jews in Poland during the war, and I think that many times we have a very narrow aspect reference when we talk about religious life in the Warsaw Ghetto, because usually we talk about Rabbi Shimon Huberband, who was part of the archival underground of Onyx Shabbat, or we talk about the Admor of Piaseczna, the Rabbi of Piaseczna, who we have his lectures. Now, I'm saying it's partial because if one would have had to list the great rabbis who lived in the Warsaw Ghetto, those would not be necessarily the names he will mention. The brother of the Rabbi of Gur was there, and many other very prominent rabbis who were struggling just like any other. Now, we can see the importance of rabbis in a few places. First of all, of course, what I already mentioned, the information. When somebody is fleeing from Helmeno, okay, or this Shlemek Wiener Grainovsky, who is fleeing from Helmeno, he doesn't know who the underground is, and he's coming to this small shtetl Grabov, he's going to the rabbi. And there is some kind of connection. There is a Haredic researcher, Esther Farbstein, who wrote about the important part of the rabbis, who many times use phrases from the Bible, trying to warn people and to explain what is going on or what they believe is going on. But they too, just like anybody else who was responsible of other people, any leader in the ghetto, there wasn't anything they could do in order to save everybody. And when you're reading their documents, you can see their breaking points as well. For example, we can see that many of the Jews, of the Orthodox Jews, took off their beards in the very early times. But still, when Jürgen Stroop is he has this album of photos which he's preparing, you find there are two pictures of Jews, rabbis, which we know their names, who kept their beards until 1943. Now, keeping the beards as young people, it means that those people were not working or not walking in the street freely. And we can see here a different kind of resistance to the Germans, which continued until the uprising itself. At the same time, there were many breaking points within this public, and it's very, very complicated, which in this book I refer only to specific aspects of it.
Great. Well, we'll look forward to your next book. And just to pick up for some listeners, Jürgen Stroop was the Nazi military officer, the general who led the final liquidation, burning down block by block and killing all the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. And that was in his report about the destruction of the ghetto. They had pictures. I would be we would be remiss if we didn't turn to your kind of claims at the end of your book, where you sort of articulate some of the conceptual, I think, conclusions that your research drew you toward. And you offer a kind of provocative new theory of how to think about resistance in the Holocaust context. And instead of talking about resistance in the Holocaust, you advocate for reconceiving resistance in terms of resistance to. And if you could talk a little bit about what you see as at stake in that shift in sort of nomenclature and in conception.
Thank you, Sven-Erik. As you well know, resistance is a major term within Holocaust studies. And actually, right after the Second World War, everybody, all nations in Europe, and the Jewish people is included, everybody wanted to show their part in winning the war over the Nazis. And then they were talking about resistance only as fighting. I'm talking about, it could be Warsaw Ghetto, it could be the partisans and other things. But it took time to understand that there were other forms of resistance. And then there was talking about passive and active resistance. But we all know that there is nothing passive in establishing an education system in a ghetto or praying or whatever else. And then today, many times scholars are talking about the term Amidah, that I know that you and I both don't like very much. Amidah became like a symbol for anything that Jews did during the Holocaust. And when something is so wide, I think it cannot really be helpful. And what I was trying to say that I think that we need to refer more to the Jewish awareness. And here I think that maybe we're not so far away from each other. I think we need to ask ourselves, not only what Jews, but when somebody did an action, any action, was it in awareness and an understanding that they want to do something to resist the Germans or not? Now, if we will look at the Warsaw Ghetto, we have here two main ways of resisting the Germans. We have the underground, which are saying we are resisting the Nazi ideology. We're fighting with, are saying that the Jews cannot fight, or we're revenging. This is the language that they are using. But if you're looking at those Jews, tens of thousands of those Jews who were hiding and disobeying the German orders, they were doing it also in a notion of resistance. They didn't want to obey the German orders. They didn't believe the Germans in anything they said. And actually, I think that when you look at those sources, you understand that you cannot realize what the Warsaw Ghetto was if you look only at the fighting groups or only on those Jews who were hiding and disobeying the German orders. Because actually, if we were talking only about the fighting itself, impressive as it can be after such a long time of Nazi occupation, there were only a few days of shooting. There wasn't something very long. And if we were to be talking only of the civilian resistance, we were talking about Jews fleeing, running, hiding, staying in their hiding place, even when the houses are collapsing and so on. It wouldn't have the same impact. What we can see during the Warsaw Ghetto, and I think this is what made it so impressive, is the fact that people who resisted two different aspects of the Nazism acted in the same geographical sphere and in the same time. And this is what really made, from my point of view, the Warsaw Ghetto to what it really was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, I think that the question of resistance for and we talked about the Amida and the kind of expansion of or inflation maybe of that notion. You know, I'm not particularly against that, but I agree that when something becomes so expansive, it loses some explanatory power. And I think there's also maybe a difference that I'm a very historically minded, I think, a literary scholar, but I'm a literary scholar and you're an historian and a very literary kind of minded. You have a lot of poetry and Władysław Zlengel makes a lot of appearances in your book. A Polish language Jewish poet who was in the Warsaw Ghetto, who wrote incredible things. But I guess the question, I think, like you're saying that there's a kind of a tendency to want to look for who resisted, who fought, and I worry about the question of resistance, and I wonder. I would love to get your thoughts about this, that there might be a kind of a danger that it's always, even if we expand the kind of umbrella term of resistance and include as many people under it, it always is kind of still a process of excusing them from the exception of those who didn't resist, right? And they are the exceptional ones who did. And I think there's a psychological reason for that. There's a kind of a political reason for that. And there was originally a kind of a charge of, which I think is, understandable maybe, but kind of terrible, that Jews went like sheep to their killing, and people were trying to kind of redeem Holocaust victims from that. But I think if where I start from is that that is just not necessary. There's just like the point is that no human being should be in such circumstances, and if you were overwhelmed or taking care of your children or you're elderly or not, for all the reasons, you're weak, you're not getting any nutrition, there's all kinds of reasons what you can't believe that this is even going to happen. There are reasons that you didn't engage in anything that might look like resistance in any kind of traditional sense. I don't think that we should. I think that the whole kind of idea of resistance has a built-in danger to blame the victims. Let's put it that way. And so yeah.
Here I want to say something. First of all, I think that we need to stress this because today we can hear that as well as we can hear, well, if they would not have had the uprising, maybe Jews could have survived more or things like that. I think it should be very clear there is only one group who should be blamed for what happened in the Warsaw Ghetto, and those are the Germans. And I don't blame any victim for any choice, even if it was a bad choice. Any victim, I won't be blaming for any decision he or she made during the Holocaust. And I don't feel any urge to expand the manner of this term of resistance, but one of the aspects of the Warsaw Ghetto is that it was a mass uprising. Dozens of thousands of Jews took part of it, and we never talked about them. And you're right that there were times when, in Israel for sure, but maybe in other societies as well, there was a blaming of the survivors. How come you survived? And if you haven't fought in the Warsaw Ghetto, so maybe you betrayed the Jewish nation or other Jews or so on. But I think we're very far from that today, or at least I want to think that we are very far from that today, and that we understand that each and every experience of a Holocaust survivor or victim was unique. I can give example of people who were in the same building in Warsaw Ghetto or the same bunk in Auschwitz and had totally different experience. And I think that if we look at their experience, we learn a lot about the Holocaust and about societies and human beings as well. So this is my perspective about resistance, not trying to expand or to expect or anything else.
Thank you. Your book is really remarkably researched. It's quite impressive, and I wondered, and also in early Holocaust historiography. Well, I mean, it depends on who was doing it, right? So there was early Jewish historiography of the Holocaust, but then the mainstream, which became kind of the paradigmatic sort of dominant form of Holocaust historiography, Jewish sources tended to be eschewed as being too subjective or not objective, not reliable enough, and Nazi sources were kind of the gold standard of early Holocaust historiography. Whether by Germans or by Jewish authors, it didn't really matter. So I'm thinking Hilberg and so on. But your book looks predominantly at Jewish sources, and kind of, I would say, correct me if I'm wrong or if you would agree with me, but I would say you kind of look at German sources on a strictly as necessary basis, that it is necessary sometimes to understand the ghetto uprising and situation in the ghetto, especially this conflict between different German authorities and their the unresolved nature of what their plans were for the remaining Jews in the ghetto. But can you talk about the sources that you explored, and did you maybe talk about an unexpected finding that you had in the archives, or and also if you could talk about your experience of the work on this project that was incredibly important, but also a very emotionally difficult topic to engage with.
Yeah. So first of all, you're of course right, Sven Eric, referring to the fact that in the beginning, actually, there wasn't any Holocaust research done at all. It was research about Nazism. It took time to understand that one could and should talk not only about what was done to the Jews, but what the Jews themselves did. And here I'm talking about Yehuda Bauer and Israel Gutman. Later on, it became a globalized phenomena, but part of it was really a methodological basic turn, saying that Jewish sources are important, because you mentioned Hilberg and others who said, well, the fact no Jew knew what somebody talked about in Berlin, in Wannsee, so it doesn't matter what they wrote. Actually, if you want to understand the Jewish life, and this is what I wanted to do in my book, you have to use mainly Jewish sources, because they talk a lot about what happened to them, what did they believe, what did they understand, and so on. I'm using other sources, some Polish sources who saw the ghetto from the outside are less important for me. We have a few that refer, especially around the dramatic and awful days of the Great Deportation, but of course the German sources. And as you already hinted, they were the most problematic, because one of the problems is when you read German sources, and many of the beginning of Holocaust research was based on German sources, you hear about the Jews from the German point of view. And I think it's very, very clear from the photos, which are exceptional historical sources, which I was trying to use in my book, alongside the literature works. And I was trying to use whatever I can. And I must admit that some of the photos challenged me quite a lot. And I'll give just one example. When I was starting working on the book, one of the things that was clear for me, and we only hinted at before, is that I must make clear that the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was a true brutality of the Germans, of mass killing, of sexual abuse, of really burning people alive, of mocking them. This is part of the story. And I knew quite early, I found quite early, very difficult pictures. We know that when the Jews were taken out of their hiding place, if they were caught, the German forces, there is an order of Jürgen Strupp, you mentioned before, the commander of the fighting, the uprising, saying that the Jews should be undressed. And I have had a few pictures of Jewish women being forced to undress in the middle of the street in front of the eyes of their family members who were dragged with them out of the bunkers. And I was sure that those are photos that I will put in the book because this is part of the story, especially one of them that was very powerful. And when I was in the final stages of the Hebrew version of the book, it was said that the English version, is published by Yad Vashem and Brandeis University Press. The Hebrew version was by Yad Vashem, and I started to talk about it with them, and they said, "Listen, you cannot show this picture. It's not only disrespect of this woman. We don't know who she was. We can't ask her, but it's too difficult." And I didn't know what I should do because I didn't want to bury this woman in the archives. But on the other hand, I was afraid that even first of all, it's a disrespect for her, but people might just read the book and close it because the descriptions are too difficult. And actually, I had this problem not only with photos, but some of the sources as well, because I had awful descriptions of people burning alive. So should I put it? Or should I leave it out? Should I put a very explicit description of rape, or should I leave it out? And I really struggled with that. And what I did with the written sources, I have them in a hinted way in the text, and I have the full source in the footnotes, or at least more in the footnotes. It's not always really solving the problem because friends told me, the eyes run there and you see the horrible in its true and full aspect. Regarding the photo, what I did at the end was I didn't include the photo, but I described it.
Mhm.
Whoever wants to see it can find it in the archive, and I can say whenever I share this hesitation with students, some of them say, well, this is what you should have done. But I have few students or friends or colleagues who are very, very angry at me, saying that I had an opportunity to present this awful aspect and to liberate this woman from the archive, and I didn't do it. So I don't know what was the right choice to do. I can explain why I decided this and not the other way, but this is one of the struggling points I had with those sources.
Yeah, thank you. I can see that is indeed a struggle, and whatever decision you make, there's not one right decision to make, right? It's difficult. We have some questions coming in from our viewers, and I want to share some of them with you. Um, uh, and one is related to what you just said, and it's uh, what was the response to your book among survivors? The survivor community is obviously shrinking given just historical realities, but has there been a response among, you said colleagues and friends, but were there people, families, or maybe even children of survivors or something that had responses to your work?
So many survivors who saw the book or early version draft were very much touched of it, and at least what they expressed to me was thanks. But you never know. You never know if some people are offended. Why haven't you talked about this or that? I had a few Holocaust survivors or family members of Holocaust survivors who mentioned, well, this resembles my story, and I felt as if they wanted their family story to be incorporated in the book. I couldn't do that. I didn't have any specific criticism of Holocaust survivors from the Warsaw Ghetto. I had from other ghettos saying that, well, this was different here or there, but usually maybe they just were nice to me, but I didn't hear any harsh criticism. And I see that one of the questions is to you, so maybe I will read that to you.
Oh,
Does your
sure.
reading of ghetto literature reveals different thoughts about resistance?
Thank you for the question. So the question of resistance does it reveal different forms of resistance? So as I said, I kind of did something that's maybe a little bit atypical in my readings of literature, and that is that I didn't really take up the question either of resistance, not directly at least, not resistance or testimony. And I don't have an axe to grind or anything. I'm not in a polemic against these concepts. Um, but I found that if these are kind of predetermined categories that we are taking from our moment as scholars and kind of superimposing on a very complicated world, and a complicated world of thinking, that I was interested in pursuing in my readings of the literary texts written in the ghettos. And I didn't want to start with a kind of preconceived notion that they are essentially about resistance or essentially about testimony. I think inherently, writing is one can say that it's inherently an act of resistance to take a stand and say, I'm a human being, I'm going to write literature, I'm going to think and not be reduced to the kind of form that the Nazis want to reduce me to. And it is a kind of bearing witness. But I think that what I try to do is not have preconceived notions as much as possible and let the very rich kind of dynamics of the literary thinking in these texts tell me how to think about it. So I was trying to think with the text rather than think simply about them or place them into a category. So there's also a lot of vibrant, brilliant thought coming out and trying to understand these changed circumstances in the ghettos and how literary, it's kind of the parameters of literary genres and expectations, sort of the preconditions, the social norms that literature tends to take for granted, how those social norms didn't obtain in these extreme circumstances, and what does it mean to be writing in these forms that kind of harken back to those forms, but are also at a terrible, there's a terrible chasm that kind of yawns between them. So people are trying to situate, both assert themselves as human beings and as authors and as mention, but also taking the measure of the distance between kind of normal European life and so I was trying to think in those terms more than in terms of resistance. I think the other reason why resistance is not as prominent in the work that I did is because for the Warsaw Ghetto writings, I wrote on texts that were preserved in the Oyneg Shabbos archive. And this was a massive archival project led by Emanuel Ringelblum, a historian in the Warsaw Ghetto. And they buried these documents. They're trying to document as much as they possibly could about Jewish life in the ghetto, and they buried these in three different caches. So the first one was on August 3rd, 1942, so in the midst of the Great Deportation. The second one was February 1943, so a few months before the uprising, but after the deportation. And then there was a third that dealt mostly with the uprising, but the third one was never recovered. It was probably burnt in the, I imagine it was destroyed. So the documents that I would have probably engaged with that would have been absolutely explicitly about resistance simply were destroyed, and so I didn't engage with those. That's what I can say about that.
And maybe, many of your heroes, and actually mine as well, perished before they could write anything about the uprising, which is part of the tragedy.
Absolutely, yeah. So my sort of corpus ends rather abruptly, and doesn't include the uprising. Yeah, just for contingent awful reasons. Yeah. Okay, so another question, maybe one that's to both of us. As teachers, do you find having to speak about this history in any new or specific manner for Gen Z or younger students?
Well, I think that talking to younger students, and it might be different, for sure it's different in Israel and in other places, actually, young people like to talk about revolts and uprising and underground and shooting and fighting and jumping. And I can cite here Edelman in a later account when Hannah Karel was interviewing. He asked, was it better to jump from a roof than to hide? And she's saying, yes, describe something like that. But he knew better. He knew that the story of others was not as less important than his. So the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is something that young people many times like to hear. I'm not sure that they like to hear of the aspect that I'm talking about. And I'll say a general thing. I don't think anybody should hear about the Holocaust and have the feeling, oh, we managed. It was bad, but we were okay. We did well. Nobody did well during the Holocaust. It was a horrible defeat, Jewish, human, whatever, European. And I think that part of it is to talk about especially for youngsters, and to explain that first and foremost, it was an awful tragedy, that people tried to do the best they could, but those were awful days and nights. And I think that this would be one of the challenges. Maybe later on we can talk about challenges of AI, but that's a different story, referring not only to the Warsaw Ghetto.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is an inherent it's just a fact that the Holocaust is not there's no happy end, right? It's very hard to um it's just murder 6 million times over and over and over, and that is difficult. I so in the in my teaching, I have found that undergraduates, now I'm not talking about the uprising and so much. I mean, I do when I teach the Holocaust, but when I teach Holocaust literature and in the course of writing the book, I was fortunate to teach both on the undergraduate and graduate level with some of the text and that I talk about in the book and some text around those texts. And I found that undergraduates liked reading things that were not so canonical. I mean, nothing wrong with the canonical greats of uh, Primo Levi and Elie Wiesel and Anna Frank, and those are all great texts to read. But to read some things that they'd never heard of, and I sort of could tell them, look, you're reading things that not many people your age have ever read, or maybe people any age have ever read, and we're going to talk about them deeply and situate them carefully. And when I couch it sort of that way, I think they kind of felt like, oh, this is sort of special, and that we're doing something that maybe students at another university might not be doing. And maybe more will be doing it, hopefully. But when I was doing it, I felt like it wasn't the most common way to teach Holocaust literature. So I found that students did connect with it. I think we're gonna have to end with maybe a question and then begin to wrap up because it looks like we've coming down to the end of our time, and there are so many questions. And I apologize to anyone whose question I am not able to get to. Um, Maybe I'll actually pool two questions and kind of finesse it that way to get a little bit more. So one of the questions is something that you talk about, and it's a question of how did the different political groups that were engaged in fighting, did they or how did they or did they not overcome their differences? So you mentioned earlier the ZOB, I'm not pronouncing it correctly in Polish, but the Jewish Combat Organization, which was the kind of umbrella group of several different Bundist and communist and so on groups, and then the ZZW, the Jewish Military Union, which was more the Beitar revisionist Zionists, and those two groups. And so one question was, how did the different sort of Zionist, socialist, communist groups, how did they coordinate? Did they work together? Did they overcome their differences or not? And then I think another question that we can maybe pool with that would be, well, it's actually a little bit different question, but I'll still ask it to you and for you to wrap up with questions. How does it change how we think about the uprising if we think about it as the people's uprising versus uh, as it's traditionally been thought of as this military kind of incredibly courageous, but mostly a military act. And so I'll just leave you with those two questions, and I think that'll have to be the final ones for today.
Thank you so much, Sven Eric. So the first one, we can talk for an hour and more just on those underground armed underground. I think they were very, very different, and of course they didn't manage with each other. This is why there were two different undergrounds. The more known one is the one of Mordechai Levich, and that is of the Job. It included everybody, any political and youth movement except the Beitar. That means Hashomer HaTzair and Dror and the Communist and Polei Tzion and others. It were everybody except the Beitarim that we will talk about. The revisionists, we'll talk about them in a second. And they had many struggles in them, but basically this is not an armed force. Those are a group of young people. Most of them didn't have any military background, that continued to work together as a group during the Holocaust. There were members of this or that group that took care of their family, and before the fighting wanted to join those groups, and they didn't accept them. So it's it's more rounded around friends than a military organization and so on. And it had many struggles in it, actually many fights, until some of those survivors passed away just a few years ago. What was the Bund part, and why did it join later, and what was HaShomer HaTzair, and sometimes, and actually each one of those groups who were part of the Job felt that their story is not told enough. I heard it from members of HaShomer HaTzair or Abund, and I think they are all right, because each one of them felt that their story is not told in a sufficient way. The Jezhevo is even more complicated, because from the Job we had a few of its commanders who survived, Tzive Lubetkin and Marek Edelman, and Ante Zuckerman was in the Aryan side, but Noela was a great speaker. And from the Jezhevo, we didn't have actually any survivor from the leading forces. And today we know, thanks to the research of Lawrence Weinbaum and Derek Libionka, that much of the knowledge we thought we know about the Jezhevo was complete lies told after the war by Poles who maybe sell weapons and later on sell these armed resistance groups to the Germans. And there are many things we don't know until today regarding its commanders and so on, but this was a much more military group, and it accepted everybody. It had communists, it had Orthodox, it had everybody. So those were very different groups. They had many fights between themselves, but at the bottom line, just before the uprising, each one of them concentrated in a different place. The Jezhevo mainly in Moronovska, plots, others in a different place, and we can talk a lot about it. Much was written about it, because there was so much written about the armed resistance groups and the fights among them. So that's for the first question. The second question is, of course, a very difficult one. How does it change? What? And it's a great question. Why is it so important to talk about the people's uprising? And I think that when you understand that this is not an uprising only of young people with armed weapon who wants to shoot Germans, but desperate people, some of them who had lost their whole families, some of them who had still one child or old woman or old mother, that are taking part in this event, and their suffering and their understanding, this gives us a whole different understanding, not only of the Warsaw Uprising, but of the Warsaw Ghetto and of the Holocaust. And I think this is also important.
So Javi and Sven Eric, thank you both for such a rich and thought-provoking conversation. And I want to congratulate both of you on your latest books. And Javi, I look forward to your new book. You gave us a little bit of a teaser. So Javi, your work challenges us not only to revisit the history of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, but to consider how we define resistance, courage, and collective experience under unimaginable conditions. You've expanded the story in ways that are both deeply and intellectually urgent. And I thank you so very much. And Sven Eric, thank you for guiding this important discussion with such great care and insight, bringing out both the scholarly depth and the moral complexity at the heart of this work. I'm deeply, deeply grateful. And this conversation was a powerful reminder of the importance of forums and spaces like Ford Hall Forum. They allow us not just to learn history, but to wrestle with its meaning. So I'd like the audience to give you a collective round of applause. Their mics are muted, of course, but I'm sure that they are giving you a round of a richly, richly deserved applause. So thank you both so very much. Have a good afternoon. Thank you.